I want to explore how what we call Asian folk magic today is an amalgamation of really old indigenous traditions, ancestor veneration, shamanistic practices, Buddhism, and Taoism, filtered always through a very localized, regional, even clan specific or ethnic specific lens. This is a long lecture because we spend quite some time on historical origins, the history of how these different paths interacted, particularly in East Asia, and why there is this wide chasm between intellectuals or academics with rigid categories and the common folk actually born and raised into these cultural traditions, actively engaged with the spirits of these paths. When you look at how folk magic is practiced across much of Asia, there is absolutely, unequivocally no denying that you're going to see integrations of Buddhism and Taoism. In fact, I would go so far as to make the case that you can't untangle Buddhism and Taoism from any localized regional form of folk magic, spirit mediumship, or shamanism, and we'll also spend a little time explaining why those terms are imperfect outside observer translations. Where the line divides between Buddhism, Taoism, and regional folk magical practices is blurry and messy in real life, and apparently is only clear and well defined by scholars in ivory towers a hemisphere away. To add another layer of social and cultural complexity, within Buddhism, you've got disagreements around whether you can permissibly syncretize Buddhism and Taoism together. And then within Taoism, same discourse. There are Taoists who say you cannot and should not blend Buddhism into Taoism. Yet none of those theoretical conversations around doctrine or canon account for the very real fact that, well, Mazu from the Taoist pantheon, regional to the South Pacific, is described as related to Kuan Yin, Guanyin Pusa, a bodhisattva in Buddhism, or how the medieval Lingbao lineages in Taoism heavily integrated scriptural traditions around Amitofo, the Amitabha Buddha. Also, maybe a little too late into my research and analysis for this topical lecture, I decided to simply ask my mom, and then realized we were operating under rather different baseline definitions for what magic even is, and that kind of gave me an aha moment. I'm Benabel, author of I Ching the Oracle, an annotated translation and study of the Book of Change, restoring it to its shamanic origins, and the Tao of Craft, a practical introduction to the principles behind Fu talismans. I was born and raised in the folk magical and Dangyi spirit mediumship traditions of southern Taiwan. Also, born and raised Mahayana Buddhist, though realizing later in life that it's actually rather Taoist coded, and then leveraged my academic background in legal research and jurisprudence to really study Taoism and esoteric Buddhism. Focusing on the sinosphere, our cradle of civilization is the Yellow River. Think, for comparison, other commonly cited cradles of civilization like Mesopotamia and the cultural and spiritual traditions arising from that region, or the Nile Valley, Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and so on. When you're talking about the cultures and societies in East Asia, they arose from the indigenous traditions of the Yellow River. Those indigenous traditions became the progenitor of the folk magical practices we've got today. From an academic standpoint, for any of us magical practitioners and occultists of the sinosphere, it is important to learn and study about those indigenous traditions of the Yellow River because that's where we come from. From a spiritual standpoint, learning about them will awaken those ancestral memories, or if it's not in your ancestry, the act of diligent study is itself a form of invocation, getting the attention of the gods and spirits of the tradition. And so, what are the roots of Asian folk magic? It's veneration of Tian, heaven, and this belief that a whole realm of celestial beings reside in heaven, like a totally different and incomprehensible species from the humans and animals on Earth, but a full on, bona fide, separate world from the above. At some point long, long ago, we all descended from the above to Earth. Enter ancient alien theorists, but I digress. And because that's where we come from, just like how you inherit features from your parents and grandparents, we inherit features from that heaven, a primordial divine seed within each and every one of us. And the further we wander away from the divinity, from that divinity, the more we yearn to reunite with it. Enter spiritual cultivation practices, long established systems keyed to reunion with that divine. Divination, being in the name, is our way of communicating with the spirit realm. Just like gift giving and mutual bargained for exchange being important in human society, offerings, sacrifices, and reciprocity with spirits is super important. And we often rely on shamans, spirit mediums, priests, and priestesses, particularly tuned into that realm, to help us mediate. Ancestor veneration and also respect for local nature spirits and land spirits goes farther back than the Shang dynasty, where the dead, our ancestors, were very, very much integrated and part of the living world. These are the old roots of Asian folk magic that you still see vibrant and alive today. From pre-Qin shamanistic traditions, we also get yin and yang theory, gan ying, a subject so important we're going to cover it in a separate future video, and wu xing theory, the five elemental phases of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, which paired with yin and yang explain the seasons, land formations, human health, geopolitical eras, and well, everything. That underlying principle of yin and yang to the Chinese mind has parallels in the doctrines of non-dualism, impermanence, dependent origination, and also the ultimate messaging of the middle path we find in Buddhism. Hence, Taoism and Buddhism feeling intuitively compatible. One important point for clarification. When we say Asia, it's a term for convenience because there's no unity or homogeny in Asia. We are constantly focusing on and fighting over our differences and discriminating against one another instead of harmonizing through our similarities, which, may or may not be a bit antithetical to our Buddhist and Taoist faiths, but hey, who's tracking? Which is to say, how indigenous foundations, Taoism, Buddhism, and even Confucianism, which we really didn't get into in this video, synthesize at the local region-specific level becomes unmanageably diverse. Buddhism in its place of origin, Nepal or Northeast India, is a different Buddhism from what's practiced in Southeast Asia, be that the peninsula or the island nations of the South Pacific, which differ from the Buddhism you'll find in Tibet, which is not the same Buddhism you'll find practiced across China, which itself, by the way, is really, really diverse and hard to generalize, and both South Korea and Japan have given rise to distinct schools of Mahayana Buddhism. What we should not do is make the mistake of ranking geographic or historical proximity to Buddhism's origins as more or less authentic. Different doesn't mean tainted. One of my important personal undertakings for myself is the Buddhist pilgrimage across the many regions of continental Asia and the Pacific to learn how Buddhism and Taoism are practiced differently by different people, and to sincerely honor that. The birth of Buddhism is generally dated to around the 5th century BC, arising from broader Vedic and ascetic traditions of the time. Its teachings spread through oral transmission in the century after, diversified into different iterations through various schisms, and expanded westward into Central Asia and eastward into China and Southeast Asia. Taoism's origins are very Taoist, which is to say, it depends on how we define Taoism. Between the 12th and 10th centuries BCE during the Shang dynasty, we've already got forms of hexagram divination. 9th and 8th centuries BCE is when we attribute the 64 hexagrams, the judgments and line statements only, no 10 wings yet. These are the translations you see in my book, I Ching the Oracle. Lao Tzu lived sometime during the 6th through 5th centuries BC, and then in the subsequent centuries of the Zhou and Warring States period, the 10 wings gets added to the I Ching. We get a completed Tao Te Ching, and this is around the time of the philosopher Zhuangzi. The stuff that came long before Taoism, like those early shamanistic traditions and the I Ching, but became integral to Taoism. Would you call that the starting point of Taoism? And what about the stuff we call historical Taoism that radically changed from what Taoism initially was, where early iterations probably would not even recognize the later iterations of itself? What parts of that cycle of change is or isn't official Taoism? Within the umbrella term of Taoism, the scope of what exactly we even mean is rather broad, and a lot of that has to do with distinct cultural enclaves. Zhengyi, lineage traditions of Taoist mystical practice, looks quite different if it's a temple nestled in a Cantonese community on the mainland versus a temple nestled in a Hakka community in Taiwan or even in Singapore. There can often be quite a bit of ideological tensions between the groups, all while both are operating under the same banner. Qianzhen Taoist traditions, as you would see it in actual practice in northern China, such as in Shandong, where my father-in-law is from, is historically celibate and monastic. But then modern versions identifying as Qianzhen in Southeast Asia today are not celibate, and the northern versus southern schools have widely different objectives and value propositions. That's because Qianzhen Dao is a set religious tradition under the umbrella of Taoist traditions, and itself contains many different offshoot lineages, or pai, each with their own unique set of practices. Qianzhen itself, as a magical mystery tradition, originates back to the 12th and 13th centuries. Its specific ritual practices, the canonical texts they might emphasize, even beliefs, values, and doctrines differ depending on whether that Qianzhen temple is in northern China, or Macau, Taiwan, or Singapore, and even whether it's Hakka or Hokkien, Minnan, or Cantonese. And those three ethnic groups in particular, ethnic might not be the right word, those enclaves or family clans, all at some point in Chinese history fought and killed each other. So even though they might all claim the same umbrella tradition and moniker, they disagree with each other vehemently. Not to even mention whether the Jin dynasty priests of Qianzhen would even recognize their own lineage as it is in the 21st century is a very good question. Then there are local folk tensions between Qianzhen and Zhengyi Dao, the rivalry over who is more legit, whether Taoism should be syncretized with Buddhism, or whether that's something true Taoist practitioners need to be dismantling. These are all part of the ongoing discourse. Being of Hakka descent and also ancestry from Fujian and Taiwan, the lineages I'm most familiar with would be under Zhengyi Dao. Zhengyi basically translates to the one and righteous path. Growing up, I was told that you can track the expansion and migratory patterns of the Zhengyi right alongside the migratory patterns of the Hakka people. Now, within Taoism, you have Taoists who reject any tint of Buddhism and work actively on eradicating tints of Buddhism from what they believe is pure orthodox Taoism, though I might also point out that there's often underlying unspoken streams of nationalism and ethnocentrism when we're talking about orthodox lineage Taoism. Whereas you've also got Taoists who very much integrate Buddhism into their practice, and there are Buddhists who view Taoism as cultural and therefore not incompatible with their practice of Buddhism. Case in point, Lingbao Pai, which has roots traced back to Ge Hong's lineage, that alchemist, physician, and scholar you often hear me talking about. The concept of bodhisattva vows among practitioners references to Buddhas and bodhisattvas in Lingbao liturgy and scriptural traditions, or even the importance placed on Amitofo. When we're talking specifically about Taoist occultism, you're going to hear a lot about Maosan lineages, but what does that even refer to? Maosan can refer to a tradition of Taoism originating from the sacred Mount Mao in the Jiangsu province, considered a holy site. More commonly today, Maosan is a reference to Taoist magic and sorcery that integrates esoteric or occult Buddhism. Today, for those in the know, you might spot how Maosan and Jing get used interchangeably, which is to say, someone might cite one of the two but mean the other. Jing Pai is most closely associated with the Taoist priestess Wei Huacun, who became an immortalized matriarch of the tradition, but is also generally venerated by many from a broader folk perspective. Within mystical Taoism, there are a lot of reconstructed lineages where there is a difference in opinion even amongst that lineage's own practitioners. This is one of the greatest challenges where you're trying to balance what can be historically verified with what's personal gnosis or divine revelation from claimants of the lineage. Lingbao is one historical example. Its origins date back to 300 AD, and around 400 AD, Ge Hong's nephew, Ge Chaofu, receives divine revelatory transmissions, and he writes them down into what forms the Lingbao canon. But by the Yuan dynasty, around 1271 AD to the early 1900s, arguably the Lingbao no longer existed. Any of its legacies by then got absorbed into other traditions like Shangqing and Zhengyi. Post-1950s, we first see it emerging in Taiwan, with certain masters claiming they remain part of its unbroken lineage but had simply gone underground. Therefore, they were the true heads of the Lingbao. Still others claimed that line lost its divine right because it was their irresponsibility that caused the dismantling of the lineage, and now a new branch has received divine revelatory transmissions from the same patron deities and is now the true and legitimate temple. By the 21st century, you're now seeing pockets of Lingbao all across East Asia and Southeast Asia, and also re-emerging on the mainland. So we end up with these turf wars that become witch wars, or the Chinese Taoist version of witch wars. And who are you or I to say who's what? I wanted us to go on that side quest of covering 5 main lineages in Taoism where we find Fa Shu, or ritual magic, which I would arguably liken to mystery schools or mystery traditions. 1, it helps us to start appreciating the diversity of thought and also the importance of starting with the question, whose tradition of Taoist magic are you even talking about? A big problem I observe, especially online, is someone from one of those specific points of view judging another practitioner who clearly comes from a different region, school of practice, and tradition, and calling them as doing it wrong. Well, maybe they're doing something inconsistent with your personal approach based on what you were taught, but that doesn't mean they're doing it wrong. Even answering a question like, who has the authority to craft food talismans, or how do you craft a food talisman, is dependent on the specific point of view or school of thought you are coming from. We often unwittingly demonstrate the depth of our knowledge and wisdom when we assume the whole elephant looks and feels exactly like the small part of that elephant we're sensing. You know that old proverb, I'm sure. You read one book or listen to one single teacher or have experience with just one temple in one small region of the globe and extrapolate that out to be the whole of Taoism. So anything inconsistent with your worldview you deem as wrong, whereas intellectual humility and self-awareness of your own limited positionality are the markers of expertise. I apologize if anyone got bored by my mini course into Taoist sectarian history, but personally, I felt it was important to convey with specificity just how really, really different we all are and why there often seems to be so much infighting. Let's also not omit from the conversation what I can only describe as secular Taoism. We're talking about the bros on Reddit who self-identify as experts in Taoism, but then look at everything I just talked about in terms of the millennia of Taoist liturgy from the region that Taoism is native to and denounce it. That's not true Taoism. What they're doing fundamentally contradicts the Tao Te Ching. And those bros have a valid point. Taoism is indeed a philosophical school of thought, espousing principles like Wu Wei and Ziran, offering a body of Neigong Tai Chi practices for improving health and wellness. Taoism is also the messy drama and witch wars over who is more legitimate, who can and cannot craft food talismans, who can and cannot be a dongyi, and are dongyi even part of Taoism, or is that folk magic? And some of them are channeling Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and using Buddhist sutras in their exorcism rituals. What's that about? Officially, Orientalist scholars note Buddhism as arriving in China during the Han Dynasty. Unofficially, per local lore, especially if you visit Buddhist temples and Manichaean temples in the southern regions of China, which I have, or even Tibet, the people say Buddhism was in their lands as far back as the tail end of the Zhou dynasty. Or perhaps it was the Warring States period during Qin Shi Huang's reign, but that during this era, these southern regions weren't part of the Zhou dynasty, and therefore didn't get documented in official records. Therefore, it wasn't until the Han, one account dated to 2 BC, where we have imperial court records of Buddhism within the kingdom's borders. Also, to further muddy the waters, when Buddhism first enters China, early translations would Taoify Buddhist concepts. So, for example, instead of finding a Chinese transliteration of the Sanskrit term, or just creating a new word altogether for the Buddhist concepts, early Chinese translators would find an existing concept in Chinese as similar as possible to the Buddhist concept, and that was the translation. There was also a bit of divine timing because whether you're talking about the cultural lore and oral tradition of the Warring States period of Buddhism entering China or the more historically accepted fall and collapse of the Han Dynasty as when Buddhism gained its foothold, in both instances, it's a time when society was fragmented, socially feeling a sense of wariness and dissatisfaction with their own state of things, and were looking for new exotic ways to seek fulfillment. Interestingly, it would so happen that when Buddhism gained influential popularity in the West, it was also during a time of civil and political unrest around the world wars. By medieval China, Buddhism and Taoism are very, very much entangled with one another alongside Confucianism. As for combining Buddhism and Zhou or the magical arts, Buddhist doctrine doesn't necessarily condemn occult practice, divination, psychic or spirit mediumship, talismans, or folk magic. However, it does provide moral and ethical guardrails around the practice of such magical arts. When Buddhist clergy discourage or even prohibit occult practice, it's actually a lot more nuanced than an oversimplified, no, we don't do that. When I've spoken to Buddhist shifu and fa shi, the sentiment is more that it's extremely difficult for most people to control such powers responsibly and ethically, and those who do acquire these powers become far more susceptible to corruption. So conceptually, it's exactly on par with don't get too rich, don't get too greedy and arrogant, don't give in to excessive temptation, etc., etc. It's more about the Buddhist cultivation practice of decentering your ego, and there is a valid concern that occult practice runs a high risk of you centering your ego and sense of self-importance. So as we've previously covered, Taoism and regional folk shamanic practices merge. Then Buddhism enters and merges with that blending of Taoism and shamanism, or localized regional folk traditions. Similarly, Buddhism entering Korea merges with its local folk or shamanic traditions. In Japan, Buddhism and kami worship within Shinto merged as well and became deeply intertwined, where it was understood that the kami, nature spirits, coexist with Buddhas and bodhisattvas. Taiwan and much of Southeast Asia took a similar approach, which is how you get lore around gods regional to the land, meeting and conferring with the bodhisattvas. The Asian way, as we see in China, Korea, Japan, and much of Southeast Asia, isn't to compartmentalize religions. We seem to blend them together and explain how they all coexist. Though again, it is important to reiterate that no group of people is an ideological monolith. You will always have disagreeing and conflicting differences of opinion. So you do have the purists who emphasize how different each of these paths are and compel you to choose one and stick to an orthodox interpretation of it. Also, even those who do mix and match are smart enough to realize that Taoism and Buddhism are not interchangeable, and you have to trust that practitioners are intelligent enough to know what they're doing. Don't assume people are dumb. It's best to assume people are much more clever than you realize. As for this term, folk magic, and when and where it applies, well, that's messy too. Case in point, burning paper money for the deceased. This is the practice you see across East Asia, notably across China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia. Joss paper, or spirit paper, is designed to resemble money and provisions, from basic necessities to luxury goods, like a paper effigy of a house or a BMW, a Mercedes Benz, a Hermes handbag. I'm totally serious, this is a thing. Burning provisions to send off to the spirit world for our dearly departed is a pre-Qin indigenous practice of ancestor veneration. It's deep, deep in the cultural DNA. It's by the Tang Dynasty around 600 to 900 AD. We have court records of burning clay models of stuff and straw effigies instead of burning the actual thing itself. Buddhist practitioners themselves generally do not see any conflict between the practice and their Buddhist faith, but Buddhist clergy often do and will try to teach that there is no rational or spiritual need for burning these paper objects for the deceased. Instead, in Buddhist funerary rites, you recite sutras, mantras, and send karmic merit. Also, here's a fun conceptual question. Is burning paper effigies of money and stuff to send to the spirit world for the dead considered folk magic? I think you could argue that this practice is premised on sympathetic magic, so isn't this a form of folk magic? And yet, if you ask most lay people who practice this, they would not view it as folk magic, but rather simply as tradition. It's our custom, it's our culture. My mom, who I would say represents a certain majority consensus among people similarly situated to her, self-identifies as a Buddhist, but is also a lineaged Taoist from a Tainan temple, which, by the way, to her, to my grandparents who were the same exact way, there's no conflict here. When I asked her, is a practice like burning paper effigies on the belief and premise that they will transform into usable counterparts in the spirit realm for our departed loved ones, is that wu shu or fa shu, meaning is that the practice of magic? After all, folk, it's a community practice, a living tradition. Magic, it's ritualized intention to create an effect beyond the mundane. You're leveraging the principle of correspondences to cause something arguably extraordinary to happen. It's clearly folk magic. But she said no, and here's her reasoning. Per Taoist magical principle, a magical act would require expenditure of Jing or Shen. This is a concept we covered in a past pairing of video lectures. The seasoned practitioner of the alchemies will source power from Shen, but most commonly power is sourced from the practitioner's qi. And if you're not intentional and mindful, then you're most likely sourcing magical power from your Jing. No bueno, you don't want to be doing that. You don't want to pull from Jing, though you could, and it's powerful, but it's a finite energy source. So if you exhaust it faster than you adequately replenish it, that can cause bad luck to the practitioner, ill health, all sorts of problems. Hence this old saying we have in our culture about fortune tellers, shamans, and spirit mediums being more prone to illness or misfortune. Qi is a bit more complicated. It's better, it's the most likely source you're drawing from, though the best is Shen, meaning you are but a conduit for these spirits. You're not using any of your personal energy, you're channeling from an externalized divine source. However, it's not so easy to do, so it really requires a bit of extensive personal cultivation practice to be able to harness Shen. Per her point of view, magic requires the use and expenditure of one's personal Jing, Qi, or Shen. Burning joss doesn't require that at all. So, by her definition, it's not wushu or fa shu. It's not magic. By the way, when talking about Chinese folk magic, there are three terms in Mandarin you may hear quite a bit. 咒术. In lay use, it basically means spells and incantations, be that of a Buddhist or Taoist flavoring. Fa shu. This needs to be taught, whether it's a human teacher or an ascended master spirit of sorts teaching you the way. This is the operative methodology of magic and occult technology. Wushu translates as either the shamanic arts or as witchcraft. The etymological implication is that the practitioner is a specialized, trained, or gifted expert in acting as an intermediary between the living physical world and the spirit world. Depending on your approach to divination, it can be construed as either a methodical ritual art or as a form of spirit communication, and therefore wushu. Specific to what I share and practice, Asian folk magic is a cultural specific system of divination, healing rites, exorcisms, fu, talismanic sigil crafting, and various modalities of spirit mediumship or serving as an intermediary between the physical and spiritual realms, which are all built and assembled from Buddhism and Taoism, but then each geographic region and each ethnic enclave will have its own local flavor to that amalgamation of Buddhism and Taoism for the specific purposes of divination, talismans, and spells, faith healing, and spirit work. And it requires the expenditure of the practitioner's personally cultivated Jing qi or Shen. By the way, even referring to it as Chinese can be charged and controversial. Many ethnic minority groups currently residing within the borders of modern-day China prefer to identify their folk magical practices by their specific ethnic group and don't want it referred to as Chinese folk magic. Han, being the dominant ethnic group, is itself a broad category where Han Chinese folk magic in the north will look very different from Han Chinese folk magic in the south, northeast versus southwest regional differences, and also the Han Chinese diasporas across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Hakka are considered Han Chinese in terms of ethnicity, but there's a long history of bad blood between the Hakka and the predominant Han Chinese that they tend to want to distinguish themselves from Han Chinese and will opt to self-identify as Hakka. As for how Taiwan or Hong Kong feel about all or any of this, even the subtle political implications of spelling Taoism with a T or Taoism with a D, I Ching or I Jing, we're just going to leave this at if you know, you know. Also, the term folk magic itself, or shamanism, or witchcraft, are modern day English translations we use to describe how we observe and perceive the varying regional practices. What I mean by that is this region of, say, southern Taiwan is doing what this region of southern Taiwan does in terms of how they negotiate with spirit realms and the unseen. And then we, today in the 21st century, from the sidelines, look at them and decide that's spirit mediumship or that's shamanism. And then a lot of the times, the native practitioners look at the outsiders and accept that outsider's interpretation and then start self-identifying as such. Or funnier yet, we police and argue with each other over what terms we should or should not be using. In Western occult circles, there's often the distinction made between high magic and low magic, and the ultimate realization that it's not that simple. In Eastern occult circles, same. And just like the high magic, low magic conversation in the West, it often boils down to economics and social class. We, too, have magical practice for survival. You need to use spellcrafting to get some quick cash and scrape by, hexes, curses on people in positions of power because you don't have access to the legal system, potions and talismans for curing sickness because you don't have access to healthcare. And then there's the magical practice for spiritual transcendence, attaining sacred knowledge and understanding of the divine. Someone born into poverty who never knows where their next meal is coming from isn't all that concerned about enlightenment or immortality, and someone who since birth has only known abundance and prosperity might just intentionally try to starve themselves in search of profound meaning. My own personal eyewitness observation and pattern spotting has also been that among people from more educated or socially privileged backgrounds, there seems to be a greater tendency to integrate Buddhism into folk magic, and on the Taoist side, to become deeply interested in alchemy and the doctrinal canon. Whereas amongst people whose religious practice is more rooted in popular or vernacular culture, meanwhile, there seems to be a greater tendency toward what I affectionately call maximalist ritual Taoism. Buddhists who are against mixing in Taoism tend to be, in my personal judgmental opinion, snobby and elitist. And Taoists who are against mixing in Buddhism tend to have this ethnic purity thing going on that I don't want any part of. Rationally, I see the most credible positioning one can hold is that the integration of either Buddhism or Taoism or both into your spiritual and magical practice enhances and augments it with millennia old, long archived sacred knowledge and time-tested spiritual practices. The craft and every aspect of it, as practiced in any part of the world, necessitates being comfortable with occupying liminal space. And so, if clean cut demarcations and definitions are what you need to feel okay in life, the occult probably isn't for you.